So unfortunately, we were supposed to have one other member of our panel, Rowena Madden, was supposed to do this, but she's unable to be here. So she sends her apologies. But we're going to go with the rest of the A team and talk just a little bit about our experiences in Sandy. And so first, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves and what your role what your role is now, what your role was in Sandy. And I'll start with my good pals.
All right.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Marticek. I'm the executive director of this 82 was formerly known as the Ocean County Long-Term Recovery Group. Ran that for 6 years and then decided to stay together. And instead of confusing the entire country by going around calling ourselves the Ocean County Long-Term Recovery Group, changed our name to Compass 82. And since then, we have done a couple of projects down in Florida. We had disaster case management, one of the zones for Irma, and then in Michael, and helped out in Harvey and Baton Rouge, and just trying to take our lessons learned here at Sandy and share with the rest of the country.
And Linda, we have that picture that, yeah, so I'll let you talk about this one.
Okay. I know, I needed just one prop. They say a picture says 1,000 words. So this is my nieces. So on the far side, when they're little and the roller coaster's in the back, that's when we started the long-term recovery. And then fast forward, that's 6 years later when we ended the long-term recovery group. And I love to use this picture when I'm traveling and share because that's a lot of life, right? Like that's a lot of life when we first started and when we first ended. And these little guys, they didn't have anything to worry about. Their house didn't get impacted. They slept in the same bed. They went to the same school, the same bus stop. But we had clients during that time that didn't have that for the entire time. And when you look back and you realize that that much life went on and people were still suffering, one part I'd like to bring out, when we closed at that point, there were 800 clients that were still left stuck in the REM program from the state. And those were the ones that were stuck, literally, they were in the air. The house was raised, they couldn't finish their project. But I would like to point out, that's the easy number to figure out how many people are not back home. But multiply that number by how many are back home, but they spent their savings, their retirement, they ruined their credit, their entire financial stability for the near future, certainly a decade out, has changed. And that's because we need to do better on our systems, right? We got together and that's why I think it is important for this conversation, because we can do better this time than what we did because of what we know. And you're going to be hearing me at nauseam a couple things today, but one of them is we implement the lessons that we do know, and if we make mistakes, make a new mistake. We go around the country and we repeat the same damn mistakes over and over again, and all it does is create suffering. So I'm thankful that my nieces were good, but I put that picture up to just say, folks, let's not let 6 years go by and still have people who are not in their home, back in their homes, right, or financially ruined because of Ida. So thanks for sharing that picture.
Thank you, Sue. My name is Bobbie Ridgley, and my knowledge here is really about Sandy experience. I was the executive director of NJVOAD during Sandy. We were active for about 6 years in Sandy recovery, and we were engaged in rebuild, disaster case management, and volunteer recruitment and housing. So my role in Sandy, and he asked me to participate in some lessons learned.
Hi, I'm Lou Strugala. I am pastor of Church by the Bay, Galloway. I served as construction director and spiritual advisor during Sandy Recovery for Future with Hope. I'm not going to preach like Sue did because she'll give you a lot of lessons because we work together so well. But the reality is it's about collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. During Sandy, the one lesson that I picked up strongly was we were in competition, and that hurt people, it hurt the survivors. We need to collaborate better. We need to understand better what the strengths and weaknesses of our individual agencies are. No one agency, as much as they think they can do everything. We all have to work together better. So, can you hear me without that? Yes, got it. It does.
So we'll start down our questions. And I think, Bobbie, I'm going to pick on you first, but I'm going to pitch this to everybody, but you have first shot at it. So what worked well in Sandy that you'd like to see included in Ida Recovery?
Well, the collaboration thing is, and yeah, I keep talking about it over and over again, but it is true, and I think we were at our best when we collaborated. In about year 3 or 4, there was several of us that did a joint grant request to Robin Foundation, and I think that even really pushed that collaboration even further. I think that we have to be focused on working together because, I mean, it's just a fact. Not a single organization, including the government, can get these folks home, and the homeowners don't have the full resources. It really does create a community, and we have to be focused on that collaboration and on recovery. I will say this, I don't know if there are any donors in the room. We measure our success, measure dollars out the door, and we measure the number of people touched. That is only loosely correlated with the number of people who get recovered. And I think it's really critical to measure recovery. So we have to collaborate together, and then we have to focus on recovery. And I know it's a little difficult when you're trying to measure to your grantor, for example, that, well, I gave, this homeowner $2,000, but you have no idea whether that person ever reached the recovery line. It matters, and I think that we really have to focus on that recovery piece in concert with the collaboration.
Yeah, I think we all struggle even outside of disaster recovery. So it's this term, right, social return on investment. You look at the literature on that, and it's so difficult. I mean, because a lot of what we talk about is stories, right? We talk about survivor stories. But sometimes it's hard to quantify. We can say that we rebuilt this many homes, we did this, but we all know what we do. That we often claim a larger, if we have $1 in something, we claim that, right? And I think that kind of skews the numbers. So I do think we need to do a better job on data collection.
Well, not only do we claim it, but we don't even claim it as a success just because we put $2,000 towards the project. We have no idea oftentimes whether or not that homeowner ever reached recovery.
Yep.
And that is a huge miss in the recovery world, both from the government perspective and from the nonprofit and faith-based perspective.
So I think that you would say about this kind of idea of collaboration really came together in year 3 and 4. I totally agree with that. So for me, working in Sandy Recovery and with everybody sitting here, it seemed like we were a good year and a half just trying to know who everybody was, start to get some kind of relationships going. And I think that that's one of the advantages, like I talked about earlier, for Ida Recovery, is that many of us literally just, you know, for the last 18 months or so through COVID. But we had really ended our efforts not too long before COVID started. So we have a lot of relationships. And certainly the work I think that NJVOAD has done to try to keep folks together is going to be helpful. I mean, it's evidenced by here we are in day 41, and we're having this conference. And yes, it was last minute, but I think the fact that we started talking about recovery. We had the storm, we had Labor Day weekend, and then we were meeting starting on the Tuesday following Labor Day, talking about recovery. We were talking to the philanthropic community, the corporate community, and that's light years ahead of where we were in Sandy. So now I'm going to pick on Lou. Same question. What do you think worked well in Sandy, and would you like to see it included in Ida Recovery?
What worked well was, again, when we were able to come together and collaborate. I think one of the things I'd like to tag on to what Bobbie said, there's a lot of people that still aren't recovered from Sandy. I happen to be one of those fools who gave out my personal cell number to a lot of Sandy survivors. And I still get phone calls. We're in year 9. They're still not recovered emotionally, spiritually, financially. And where did we drop the ball in that scenario? A lot of the ball dropping came because there was no consistency, and I was construction director from Bergen County to Cape May County. I could go from one municipality to another, and I'm going to get different interpretations of building codes. We had people in Seaside Heights that were told at the last minute, you can't move home because you need to put a $50,000 telephone pole in for the power line. There has to be a consistency of service from one end of the state to the other. And I understand the financial implications in various communities. Some communities are poor, some communities are wealthy. But the consistency of building requirements has to remain the same. And I think towards the end of Sandy recovery, we started to get that. Also, the infrastructure, us as nonprofit groups had to work on infrastructure. In Atlantic City, I can't tell you the amount of sewer mains we had to replace because being an island, when Superstorm Sandy hit, the sewer mains went up and down. So instead of having a sewer main that went, or sewer lateral from the house that went down to the main, it was going up. And we had to dig up the homeowner's property. We had to dig up the street to replace that main. That should not be on the nonprofits. And someone needs to lobby for that. We started to get there towards the end of Sandy. We started to have a voice because of working together and making things happen. Right now, we're at the infancy of Ida, and we know that it's going to be more problematic because there will be less money. So we need to figure out, how do we get the responsibility of infrastructure to go where it belongs? How do we get the strengths of every group in the same place so that we can utilize people where they come in best?
You know, I think that's a lot of it. Right? But the one that I remember today, like every 2 weeks, and we're talking, you know, actually functioning against an RSF, but this idea that, you know, looking around the room, we started having these difficulties with utility connections, the pole issue, because you elevate a house 18 feet in the air, obviously that puts it a little closer to the wires, which is a safety issue. But one of the things that we realized is that where is BPU? And we realized that BPU's role has always been to be in the SEOC. But when the power comes on, they were done. And because we weren't used to having them as players in recovery. And it became very obvious that that was an agency we had to have at that table. to work through some of these things. Because they were the one agency, okay, that could talk to the gas folks and the electric folks and work through these problems for us. So I think you're absolutely right going forward. I think we are a lot better positioned than we were in Sandy, but it does take all sectors. It takes government doing everything that government can do on all levels, and then us meeting those gaps and working together in concert. And this includes the corporate community. You know, a lot of the discussion that we had, I remember around the beginning of Sandy was over, can we incorporate, you know, for-profits? Can we incorporate the corporate world? How can we leverage those assets, and what are the dangers, you know, of us being in the nonprofit side and actually working with companies? What we've learned over the past few years is that there are safe ways to do it, and that we absolutely need to leverage all the community resources to recover. So Sue, last but not least, what do you think worked well, and what would you like to see included in our recovery item?
So one of the unique things that we were able to do was recognize that there needed to be housing for the volunteers that wanted to come into the area. And we knew that churches would be a great place to house them. And then we also realized that the churches all had different levels of capability about writing a grant. Some churches may be advanced and have somebody part of the member who can write, and others were just had never written or had very little experience. So we offered to write, as the Ocean County Long-Term Recovery Group, write a consortium of faith-based into one proposal for Robin Hood. And I remember I was working for FEMA at that time, and I remember having all the different reverends and pastors in one room. And I remember they all started talking one part, and I remember I hit my hand on the table. I'm like, all right, we just need to know how many of you want to join in. And Kathy Durante, who's with the Long-Term Recovery Group in Ocean First, she said, I'll write it. Now she's given out at that point $36 million as a foundation. She said, I will write it. I just need you all to agree. And what happened was every 13 churches went together under this one proposal. They each kind of wrote a checklist of what they needed. Sometimes it was a freezer, sometimes it was handicap access, and they put down all their costs, what exactly they needed, and the rub or the incentive was, we'll help you get this, we'll do all the reporting, we didn't take a dime, every dime went in and out, and you had to just say that you would house volunteers for 2 years. And that was the trade-off. And it was a great way to, again, provide, okay, the gap was not everybody has the same level of ability to get the grant from Robin Hood at that time. Because if you didn't write a good proposal, you're probably not getting it. So by putting them all together, now you built capacity. So now they all have a little piece of the pie. We got $325,000 for them, and they were all able to come online and start having volunteers. So I think that was probably something that's a little different and unique, but you know, we rely on our faith-based community a lot, right? They're the ones literally at the end of the day when all the programs go away, but not all of them have that same ability. And I think if we are really gonna embrace them, I think probably something like that to help out some of these smaller churches that may not have a big capability of doing it. But so that I would love to see. I think we're going to need it, especially because we're so spread out moving forward. And then just going off of so whenever the government is trying to create a new program, they're doing it because somewhere along the line, a problem has been pointed out. Politicians voted on the money, and now the money is coming down for that problem. But the disconnect is, for every problem that they're throwing money at, there is probably dozens of nonprofits who have been working on that problem for decades sometimes. Except we never have that cross-sector conversation. If you're talking about food, there's food banks, food pantries. If you're talking about housing, there's nonprofit builders who've been doing it. And that is what we need to put in the forefront of this. Whenever that big money is coming down, have the cross-sector conversation, because Lord knows the nonprofits have been working on these problems. And a great example would have been, and she's not here, but I speak highly of Donna Blaze and the Affordable Housing Alliance. They've been doing stuff for decades. What a true value having Trenton, when they're designing the REM program, having some kind of conversation with someone who's been doing it for decades. To the same population. It's the LMI population, low to moderate income. That's where they focus. So include the people that work with that clientele for every day. So I hope that, I know you've been working hard, Keith, and keeping us all together. And I think those conversations just need to keep expanding. And I always say, listen, we're a nonprofit. You don't even have to buy us lunch. We even pay for the $8 parking ticket to go to Trenton. Just give us the opportunity to have there's a lot of smart people that have been doing a lot of good things. Like, let the do-gooders have some conversation on how you spend all these big dollars, because I'm pretty sure we would at least help the state make the construction plans that they all had to scrap, right? They designed these plans for all the way up and down the coast, and they spent months and probably thought they were doing really good things. And the first time they started to try to implement those plans, the towns were like, yeah, no, you can't build that here. They have to go back to the drawing board and spend more money to actually get the designs that fit on all the local properties. So I think there's a lot of knowledge, and I hope it can get plugged in on some of the higher levels.
Yeah, I think that reminds me, Sue, of Fred Fugate, okay, who many of you will remember, who was the FEMA administrator for a few years, and actually he was during the Sandy years. He does a presentation. He's really famous for the Waffle House Index, right? But he does another presentation that talks about the 7 deadly sins of emergency management. And I think it's number 5 is that what you're talking about, Sue, the failure to see that there are folks working in the community every day on these problems. So whether it's food insecurity, housing insecurity, so there's faith-based folks, there's nonprofits. We all know this, but the failure of government to actually see this and engage it, right? And I think that that's a lot of what we were talking about with IDCM and why we feel so passionate about why that should be included. Okay, I'm going to move on because otherwise we'll be here forever. So hindsight being 2020, what were the early signs that pointed to challenges that we ended up seeing in Sandy? Lou? What were some of your earliest signs that you picked up?
A lot of it was geographical. A lot of it had to do with how professional the communities wanted to treat this disaster. For example, in Atlantic City, there was a point in time we brought volunteers in and they were getting parking tickets. And we were paying $1,300 for dumpsters to empty the contents of people's homes, even though Atlantic City had their own dumpsters. And it was taking 6 weeks to get building permits. So we had to arrange a meeting with the mayor, newly elected, who got an earful from me when he was campaigning, and say, you've got dumpsters, help us. We're helping your people, help us. You've got parking tickets being issued to out-of-state plates when there's 5 cars sitting there doing work, bringing people back home, bringing money to your community, bringing resources and volunteers to your community, and you're giving them a parking ticket? Where's the insanity in that? And then the final one was, 6 weeks for a building permit? Well, he managed to get us 3-day building permits, 2 dumpsters, and parking tickets were no longer an issue because our volunteers knew, don't park in front of a fire hydrant, don't do stupid things, and you're not gonna get in a problem. Those were some of the things that we really had to deal with. And then there were other towns, every time you applied for a building permit, because I was the guy who would go in with a big smile and try to talk my way through. Oh, you need to fill out line 42X because you missed the letter on it. Excuse me, why couldn't you tell me that the first time? Why do you have to create a problem? So a lot of the things that occurred were, we were dealing with problems that were inherent to the communities that we had to fix, that I hope have been repaired because of our experience with Sandy. So now with Ida, we should be able to go in there and be a lot smoother in what we do.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not sure that we will.
I'm trying, Keith, I'm trying.
Inherently, home rule has been a difficult thing. I think we need to advocate, educate, but we're going to run into some of those same problems we already are. So, you know, I got a call from one of our muck duck crews the other day. They cleaned out this, and I won't mention the community, but they cleaned out the person's house. They did a complete muck out. They put the debris on the curb, and then the code enforcement came and red tagged all their bags. And then the mayor came, and the mayor says, well, the storm was on September 2nd, and you had 30 days, and it's October 4th, 5th, whatever day it was. So that was a teachable moment. So our muck out crews could talk to them about that debris removal. But we see that, you know, across the board. And again, not throwing anybody under the bus, but I've had a conversation with the county emergency manager who did not have any concept of what public assistance was for that program. So, I mean, we're seeing that in the kind of hyper-local focus that we have here for authority in New Jersey. It's good in some ways, but it's a barrier. So we are going to run into that again. Sue, I'm going to pick on you.
So I start off Sandy as a FEMA employee, so I have that kind of perspective to one point, then taking over as the long-term recovery. So I think it was really interesting and challenging at the same time to have so much, and this, I'm saying it in my head and I'm saying it's going to sound stupid, but it really was a blessing and a curse in a way to have so much money be thrown at us. Don't throw tomatoes at me. Because what happens is when you have so much money, it did allow for us to work more siloed in the state because you kind of had that all those resources. So in a strange way, I think it kind of allowed all of us to kind of, you know, people who were not willing to work in the sandbox and collaborate, but were, you know, on their own. And, you know, the whole reason why we try to have one system so you're not duplicating effort and all of that. So I think that was just very interesting. And because now as you go to other disasters, and certainly Ida is wearing the opposite, we know we're not going to have enough resources. But I think not having enough resources is going to help us to, out of necessity, get to the next level of collaboration. And I think one of the things that is also an advantage this time is that there is not a direct housing program that is in play, because when the disaster case management program comes online, it comes online with the breath of FEMA and the state breathing down on a daily basis to focus on getting applications, which the state nor FEMA was not successful at. So now the nonprofit comes online, and that pressure of taking care and working on those, it forces their attention to have to be touching these people. And sometimes it was like on a daily basis, because you have to report back. And meanwhile, you have all the other people that aren't getting touched, because that focus was just on it. And now that I have also been part of a couple other disasters, it was able to use that experience and kind of say, listen, if that's going to be it, then we need to be trained together. And when we were down in Michael, we got the first training that was between the FEMA direct housing people and the disaster case managers to say, hey, this is what we do, and this is what we do. Let's make sure that the client doesn't pin mommy against daddy, and let's make sure we're a united force with the client. It's going to go much easier. So that was a little bit baby step. That was the first time, like in the beginning of it still didn't work swimmingly, but there's no solution that gets solved in one action. It's about just moving the needle to make it just a little bit right. But I think we have an advantage here with a disaster case management program coming online, not having that direct housing, that we can jump right in and start getting these cases, resources, identify the gaps, and then figure out what our next handle would be for construction or resources. But I think it all comes down to getting the systems in place as soon as possible. And the sooner that we're all on the same page in a system, however that looks, the better we're going to be. Because right now, as I keep saying, we are flying blind at 41 days with not really understanding what the numbers mean. 68,000 registrations. Okay. How many speak Hindi? How many speak Arabic? How many are LMI? Now you got it. Now David knows, he's working, with his churches, and he knows in this area there are blank amount of homes that need, okay, maybe those 3 churches in that area, maybe he can start talking to them. But we could be doing that now. We need the data.
Yeah, I think, so I'm going to touch back on a little bit about, your beginning comment about how the money was a blessing and a curse. I want to explore that a little bit, because I think that is a part of some of the issues that we had with Sandy. So not only having a massive amount of money available, but the timelines of that. So remembering that first funders, was like, oh, well, we want you to spend your money. We'll give you $1 million. We know that long-term recovery often stood up around an offer of money. And, you get that call from Robin Hood or wherever and say, well, we'll give you $500,000, but you need to spend it in 12 months. How do you think that messed us up in Sandy?
So you start spending money because you have to spend the money, or you're going to lose the money. So perhaps there were things that got paid for in the early beginning days that in those later days would never be considered at a funding table, because as the money gets smaller, you have to really start thinking strategically. And yeah, I mean, you have someone that's saying, listen, and here's the crazy part. The crazy part is, with the money that's in your account, you still know, because you know the damage, right? Because Sandy, you could live and breathe it because it was 1 mile up and down the coast, where Ida's all over the place. You don't get that same feeling. So you knew that there was that damage, and you knew your community was going to need the money, but they're not going to give you any more money until you spend the money that you have already. But the systems aren't working yet. So now you're caught between a rock and a hard place. Either I'm going to start giving away some money in a little bit of a gray area. And I do remember one of our nonprofits in the beginning, when money was flowing, they could make an argument that they wanted to not make things better, but they wanted to restore the people back to what they had before. What they had before is a granite countertop. That nonprofit, so okay, right? They could do what they want, but in their head, they made that argument and they were paying for granite countertops. Fast forward 12 months, nobody getting it. Once you start getting into the rhythm and realize that you have to stress it, but at that time, there was pressure to spend the money. So
Yeah,
that's,
I think for me too, is just that it pushed. Understanding long-term recovery is long-term. So in my mind, it kind of pushed, especially our LTRs, to do things like, for instance, the DCMP is not launched yet. So we need to hire our own case managers. Then we need to hire somebody to supervise. Then we need to hire a construction manager because we think we need to do that unto ourselves. A lot of those decisions, in my mind, were kind of forced by that. I think if we were sitting like we are in Ida and saying, well, there's not going to be a ton of money to do that, I think it goes back to this idea of disincentivize collaboration. Then I think the other problem was that because funders did not understand, in year 3, when finally we got our block grant programs, we finally got our framework in place to actually rebuild people's homes and get them home, we had very few dollars to work. So I think that was kind of the curse of Sandy, but I don't think we're going to repeat that here in Ida, for sure. So last but not least, the question was, is what worked well and you'd like to see it include, or excuse me, hindsight, that was the last question.
yeah.
Hindsight being 2020, what were the early signs that pointed to challenges?
I remember, this is in the spring when I understand the first, that first spring that we were starting to rebuild, and we had worked, there was a lot of work going on in communities like that. And we were going to start working on a home on some repair work. And when we got there, previous organization had done the muck and gut and left asbestos on the lawn. And we called that organization to say, you guys, you're doing the muck and gut, deal with the asbestos. And the response was only an indication of things to come, which was, well, asbestos regulations in New Jersey are too onerous. We don't do that sort of stuff. We just help people. And I feel that was really an indicator of things to come, because we can decide as organizations whether we want to be in the world of advocacy and changing the onerous rules, or we can kind of decide if we want to help people. But I don't think they're not the same. And leaving that asbestos on the lawn was just another big headache for the homeowner. And I will say we did take care of the asbestos in the proper manner. But I think as we moved along through Sandy, we all experienced those times when it's hard and it's onerous. But if we're for the recovery piece where we're helping individuals recover, we have to take on those big problems and find solutions for them. And we can't really just leave them for the homeowners, because that's not really helping. And I think we saw that in the nonprofit world. We also saw that in the for-profit world. Plenty of for-profits that came in, did their bit to help, and just moved on. So I think that if we as the nonprofit sector, particularly case management, can get ahead of some of that and really help people not get into those situations and guide them in ways that help them not create bigger problems, that is pretty huge. So I think I was thinking about that. That was an early indicator for sure of things to come.
Yeah, one specific thing is going to be very different. Because I don't think that we're going to remember during Sandy, we had thousands of volunteers that would come from out of state. Going back to my session this morning, we're not the bright and shiny thing. COVID is ongoing. So I'm going to use Sue's term. She says it's Jersey for Jersey. And I think that provides us a lot of opportunities, right, to make it more community focused, but also to start to train up a cadre of volunteers to do this kind of work that are from New Jersey, understand New Jersey, understand the complexities that we work in. So I think that's an opportunity that we may see coming to strengthen. Luke?
Can I add just 2 points, one to Susan, one to Bobbie's? There is no government mandate on how to muck and gut. It's basically people going in there with good hearts, and sometimes they have to be given guidance. So if you have a question, you've got a group of volunteers, ask the building official what the requirements are. There were times I had to go in after somebody hung drywall, tear it all out because they never touched the electrical systems. And that became a waste of resources. The second thing is the money issue that Sue talked about was hugely problematic at the end of recovery, because the expectations that were given to disaster case managers of what we could do in construction or rebuilding people's lives changed. As the money dwindled, there was no way we could give people what they were getting at the beginning. So somebody 3 blocks away got this and this and this, and somebody here didn't get a set of stairs to get in their house. We have to be consistent, and we have, again, the collaboration part, I keep on stressing and stressing and stressing. It's huge because it affects every single one of us that's trying to do the right thing.
So a couple things that kind of lead me actually when I was putting my slides together for this morning. And that is I look back and I did that slide on what resources that we had in Sandy, and I brought up the FEMA DR report. So who wants to guess how many FEMA registrations that we had for Sandy? Round numbers, just yell it out. Anybody else? 61,000. 61,000 households. So Janet, you're about right in terms of the number of people, but 61,000 households. And I want to point out, because everybody's saying, well, Ida is not a Sandy. And on many, many levels, it's not, right? So we don't have countywide problems. We have pockets that we're seeing in Ida. But we're up to 68,000 registrations. So we're actually potentially touching more households. Now, we don't know that all those households are going to require our assistance, but they've obviously require some kind of assistance because they have filed. So I think that that's one thing, is just that, you know, the scope is different. I think the story is going to be different too. A lot of this is urban. We know what difficulties there was with a coastal storm in our shore communities, but I also want to point out that our shore communities have a whole lot more visibility. They're a better story than trying to convince people to. They're a better story than Linden, New Jersey. They're a better story than Elizabeth, right? They just are. Not making judgments. So that's a difference. And again, I think it's this other thing is just that the resources that we saw. So and I'm sorry, Rowena's not here to share, but in the 2 weeks post Sandy, I mean, she literally blew up her phone with people calling to you know, how can we volunteer? How can we help Jersey? We saw a slight uptick after Ida in our volunteer portal, but I'm talking about a couple hundred who said, okay, I want to get. We've seen some active volunteering in communities that are affected, kind of that spontaneous volunteering because of this, but we are not seeing this wave. I mentioned earlier, Tennessee, Waverly, Tennessee is still looking for people to do muck outs, they're a month before us. So, I think it is a different piece. The other thing for me is the money. And as Sue said, I think a blessing and a curse. But we had about $1 billion available to our sector in Sandy for helping people with their individual and household needs. Not going to be that this time. It's essential, right, that we get every government dollar, every insurance dollar into the survivors' recovery. Sue, you touched kind of on the rental support. I remember for 2 years on the nonprofit side on the East tables that we paid out millions of dollars in rentals. And I think it is this idea, we've early on had some discussions with, was in a discussion with the Governor's Recovery Office the other day, talking about how housing is going to be a huge problem in this. But it's not a problem that we can solve from the nonprofit sector or the NGO sector. We may have a role in it. I think repair and rebuild is part of that role. But we know that that these programs take a long time to roll out for patients. So those are some of the things that I've seen. Sue, what do you think is going to be a little different?
Well, I've said that we were able to help out in the state of Florida for a month. And I think I was naively surprised, maybe, that it's the state of Florida, right? So you're kind of thinking they've been at this game for a long time, and they always get hit by things, that they would have their stuff together. So that was a large impact, 49 counties. And I think I was kind of like surprised that literally they were kind of starting at square one again. But the length of time that had gone by between one major incident and another, there was people retired, moved out of state. So I really am excited that we are, I mean, you turn on the Zoom call and there's like 24 people on there that you've known for now 9 years, because with Sandy and then doing debriefings and all that, and then jumping right back into COVID. So like I said, I feel like if we have the right tools, we should be coming out of this with best practices, because that's the hardest thing. It's keeping the relationships together. And I think we've done a darn good job in the state doing that. So I really see that as one of the key advantages here is that we really have stayed together. And I can keep hammering home. I don't understand why we don't have the IDCM. Either our state did not ask FEMA for the IDCM, the Immediate Disaster Case Management Program, or FEMA is denying it. Those are the only two answers they can be. I'm still trying to find out what the answer is. But it's day 41. That program could be launched up until 180 days, depending on when the transition of the DCM paid. And when we're talking about the sequence of delivery, we were trying to use the coveted philanthropic dollars as the last, right? Like, you have to make sure that they get everything from FEMA and SBA and their insurance company, because you don't want to put those charitable dollars in that formula when it could have been paid by something else. We are doing the same darn thing with our state. Why are we not activating a program that not only could be in play starting 14 days after the disaster, but it could meet all the things that we're trying to figure out? How many people have apartments that they could go back into if the landlord maybe could get it repaired? How many people? All those things. And we could be setting up a successful transition to the DCM pay. And I don't understand it, but like I said, we may not be successful in turning it on, but what we will be successful at is calling out the reason why. Because it's a missed opportunity, and when people ask me, well, Sue, if that doesn't happen, you know, do you have a plan B? Okay, so the plan B is, if FEMA's not gonna give it, is the state gonna go into their coffers? Because it's a valuable program that's gonna pay them back in tenfold. Okay, if they don't do that, then what? I gotta go and see if the charity, the philanthropic dollars are going to pay for a program to triage these people until we wait 6 months for the
I think that's
disaster
a difference
management.
too. We saw in Sandy where the philanthropic community did give money. And they did do that, right? I think that we have a very different philanthropic and corporate community today that are much more educated about disaster, much more focused on sequence delivery. And I think that they become key allies with us in saying they're not going to do that. So I would suspect, you know, there are some dollars available from the philanthropic corporate community for capacity building, and certainly this might be a piece of that. But I think that would not be in place until such time as we're satisfied that every effort has been made to capture every government dollar that was needed for this. Bobbie, I know you said in the beginning you're not going to be involved in Ida Recovery, but
I do have one thought on the, one of the opportunities I think Ida that didn't feel like we had as much as Sandy, which is because of the lack of media coverage and people aren't flooding into the state to help. And I think there's a great opportunity for some of our local faith-based organizations and our Rotary clubs and our Elks clubs to really get involved in some long-term volunteer support. And, you know, but I think it's going to take the nonprofits and the other faith-based organizations to really get those folks organized and stand and stood up. But I think that with Sandy, there wasn't that need. I mean, 5 years later, we still had volunteers wanting to come into the state. And I think it's a pretty cool opportunity to develop some long-term, actually neighbors helping neighbors.
yeah, I think it's a tremendous opportunity not having the pressure of funding on LTR. So in my mind, I always went around this idea and saying, like, would it be great? And I said at the beginning of this one to somebody, would it be great if there's 300 neighborhoods, 300 communities, and you heard me talk about this morning, what if they all had LTRs? And Janet, I was actually kind of thinking about Englewood, New Jersey, okay, where, you know, the funders, if you remember, in Sandy, it was, you know, they wanted to give money on a countywide basis. I remember being asked to set up the long-term recovery group in Essex. And I was explaining to the funders that Essex doesn't exist except on a map. Because people from Essex, as we all know, they wouldn't even tell you that they're from Newark, right? They tell you, I'm from the Ironbound, I'm from Central Ward, I'm from Clinton Hill. So very neighborhood focused. And I think that kind of what we talk about is an asset-based kind of approach, or to use the FEMA term, the whole community, is would it be great, right, if we enlisted those community folks around to form an LTR? Now, what I mean by that is not get the guide out and fill out all the positions, you know, not necessarily become a 501c3, not necessarily incorporate. I mean, that might be appropriate in some places, but wouldn't it be great if we had unmet needs tables there that folks from the Rotary could bring volunteer resources, and maybe the local churches could bring some funds, and you know, the local nonprofits, the ones who are working every day on food insecurity, that are working on social justice, that are working on environmental justice, why can't they be there on that table? And you know, as I put forth this kind of, I think the opportunity is for those kind of bigger things like construction, the larger pieces of the pie. Wouldn't it be great if they had a statewide framework to connect? And that's really kind of what we've been talking about. And I think it is a tremendous opportunity to do this. Sue, back to your comment too, about we've been together. But I think that the other piece of it is that we've got a lot more experience, not only being together through Sandy, but we've also worked, as you said, in Irma. Buddy Anthony Gree just left. We've been involved, many of us, in disasters throughout the country. So one of the things that I noticed that is an opportunity is that the rules change, right? Every disaster brings a rules change, right, Laura? You know, not a massive rules change, right? But we incrementally get a little bit better on the FEMA side. And that is that knowledge about the programs and the things that have been done in other places that we can utilize here is certainly an advantage. Lou, what's your thoughts on how things are going to differ in this?
We're not gonna be able to put money.
Well, that's a
We're gonna have to manage the resources far more tightly. And we're gonna have to get a lot of buy-in from the municipalities. There were building permit costs that we had in the tens of thousands of dollars. If we're gonna help people recover, we're not gonna have that money to give to the municipality. Somehow, that's gonna have to be negotiated. The idea that and I'll use box stores because I'm safe with that one, are gonna donate product, forget it, it's not happening. Because they're donating product all over the country and it's much, much smaller than it was. We're gonna have to really manage the money hard because there is no unlimited pot anymore. And I'm sorry, let me just add, and I think the construction is gonna have to be standardized. I like what you said this morning about we're not the controllers, because I also sit on the board of VOAD, but certainly we can provide the resources to help standardize so we're not this pick and choose game that we were. And also for disaster case management, it's a disaster. It's not social services. If somebody had a problem beforehand, which I ran into a lot, we're not going to be able to work on that. As sad as that sounds, it's not disaster. We're going to have to really, really be uber focused on the disaster component.
So the challenging side is on top of what you can say, all materials have gone up. I just did a little construction project at my house. I was like, holy crap, it was like $3 for a 2x4. It's like $9 now. So that was crazy. Then the supply chain, which we're hearing about every day, our containers, just all of our Amazon stuff just floating off the coast of California. That's going to be challenging, right? Like we used to be like, all right, get appliances. It could be 2 weeks. They'll be delivered. The volunteers won't be there. So we got a couple other layers, but on the positive side, COVID has allowed for buckets upon buckets upon buckets of money to come from the feds down to the state and to the counties. We're just getting to the point of using up the CARES Act dollars, which I believe should be spent by the end of this year. But next year starts the Family Rescue Act dollars. And I know there is a possibility to go after those dollars and do it with construction. So there's a great opportunity for us, but that means we got to have the construction side, whatever we're going to be trying to piece together here, ready to go, because you have to talk to the municipalities before they put out that money. And I would encourage that we have those conversations in the municipalities that you think you're going to work in, or the county, because they may be able to set that up when they're doing their request for proposals next year. But with that mindset, hey, there's a great way we could leverage some of these Family Rescue Act dollars, but let us show you, because again, not all those guys are going to have the understanding of what the work that was done in Sandy. But I think that is it. That is an opportunity, right? Because that is money that is free money coming down. It's not taken up by anybody's tax dollars in the county. It's not taking up any money away from other nonprofits. This is new money coming in, but that means we have to figure out how we're going to try to do construction, and then maybe target a few municipalities or counties that may be a little bit more forthcoming with that idea of okay, we can combine this COVID and with the Ida disaster and really kind of stretch it. So I think that is, you know, again, that you
Yeah,
gotta look
I think we've already seen that. Went down with the CARES Act. A lot of our counties have actually been, you know, granted we didn't get TSA, but a lot of our counties have been using CARES Act dollars. And that's good and it's bad, but I think that the good news about that is that folks on the ground, local government already see that this isn't a disaster. FEMA, you're in charge, you fix this for us, right? There have to be active participants in this. So that if nothing else, is a psychological battle. It's one that it took years to win, or maybe never. So we're going to wrap up. So first, I would ask, actually, anybody out there want to share anything or ask any questions? Janet?
I ran the Bergen County Long-Term Recovery Committee. Clear and consistent communication, community and supervisor residents about what's going on, who's getting what, where's the money coming from, where's it going, who's overseeing it, what's the process in place, just so there's complete transparency.
I think mitigation too, right? And that's one of the reasons that you've heard us kind of talk about this, is that Sandy, I felt like I was a resident of every community in Sandy, because I'd start out my morning down at Bivalve in Cumberland County and end at Jersey City. So I got to see different faces depending upon the resources that were allocated. So in Hudson County, they had so much money that we actually gave away cars. And I'm not saying that in my mind, that's justified, because the money was there. That was just for them. And there were a lot of people who depended on cars and they lost their cars in Sandy. So I could justify that. The problem was that then I would go to Cumberland County and we had a hard time getting food boxes. We had a hard time getting senior services, to understand that perhaps they should come down out of Vineland, okay, and actually come down to these people to serve them in the community center. So I saw a lot of injustice. And what I mean by that, I don't think the individual that sat on unmet needs tables were trying to be, but it was because of the way they were funded, of the way that the services were available. And I learned that it's a lot harder to be poor in Cumberland County than it is to be in, say, Passaic. So Cumberland County and Passaic keep going back and forth about being the poorest county in New Jersey. They will both tell you that they're the dent in the trash can in New Jersey. So I would hear that in the morning in Cumberland, and then I would go up, because nobody in Trenton cares about us, and I'd be like, I drove all the way down here from Trenton. And but I do think it's easier, and I'm not neglecting the fact that if you're poor anywhere, it's hard. But it's easier to be poor sometimes in Passaic, where there's transportation, where there is services, than it is to be in Cumberland, where there is no bus, there is no taxi, there is no walking. You know, people in Bivalve, people in, you know, they're not going to walk to Vineland. That's true, right? So I do think there was a lot of inequity, and that we do have the opportunity by, again, applying community resources first, but then looking at those kind of statewide resources and see how we can be more equitable. Somebody else?
I like the idea of the collaboration, but in terms of, you know, nonprofits, I know that there's a lot of competition because of getting those dollars for survival. You've
heard of the 4 C's of VOAD, right? You've heard of the 4 C's of VOAD. The competition is number 5. Or maybe it's number 1. But yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so, I'm on a board of directors for Wellspring, and drug prevention program. But, you know, we often talk about collaboration. A lot of nonprofits do the same thing, more or less, you know, so there's a lot of competition for those dollars.
Yeah, that's a discussion, Homer, that I think will never change. Okay, I mean, you know, on the baseline, you know, folks are trying to support whatever work they do. But I think that for the disaster dollars, so disaster dollars, I think there's competition for dollars every day in the nonprofit community, right, with funders. So to me, there's 2 pieces to this. One is to have funders start to see that disaster is not this abnormal event, right? That it's part of that ongoing program. So like in your example, okay, if you're working on addiction, so you have this addiction issues that you're being funded for. When a disaster strikes, really the only thing that changes for you is that there's more addiction, there's more recidivism, if you will, okay, and that's probably not the right word, but I mean slipping back, because if I can't live in my house and now I'm an addict, right? I mean, I'm going to be looking for something. And I think the same thing when we talk about hunger and everything else. So we've really worked really hard over the last 10 years, I think, to educate the philanthropic community that this disaster giving needs to be part of your everyday kind of book. So when you give to Homer to fight addiction, you're helping for the next, build the resilience, if you will, for the next. When you give it to David, okay, for the food bank, okay, to build capacity, that's more people that can be fed a bigger network. When you give it to Catholic Charities, to Val, okay, it builds around those services, housing and other things that they kind of zero in on. So I do think that that's a help. Competition will never go away. I think what's unhealthy is when you have this big mass of money that comes, like Sandy, you know, where we have a 12-12-12 concert, we raise billions of dollars, all this media attention. And now you have this huge chunk of money that funders are trying to get off their books, and then just disaster people ourselves, okay, start the Hunger Games, right? So where we start cutting, you know, Sue's going to get $1 million at Ocean County, so I'm in Monmouth County, so you know what? I got to get to that funder first. And a lot of the funding thing that the problem with that, as you point out, is that back to what I was saying, is that's how you end up with this inequity. Some LTRs should be on a county basis. That makes the most sense. Some of them might need staff. Some of them might need to become their own 501c. And that's fine, but a lot don't, right? And I think that that's an understanding that we've now got. The very first meeting that I had post Ida was with our funders, with New Jersey Grantmakers. We didn't talk to the funders. You know, we talked to them when they said, "Hey, we got a lot of money. Can you write a program to match our money?" Early on, but we didn't have really that talk about how are we going to coordinate this? How does it look on a statewide view? How does it become just? I don't ever remember talking about how it was going to be just and equitable. You know, it was often around, again, this idea of counties. And this idea, right, that, well, if Ocean County gets this, we have to give Monmouth County this. Then, oh yeah, by the way, Union, even though there were very different problems.
There's also that pushing money out and how many people got it. But again, not about recovery.
No.
Right? So our funders didn't ask us much about how many people that you worked with got recovered, actually fully recovered. They asked us how many dollars went out the door. And I think that's a big miss in all of our, how we all think about recovery, because we get too focused on the dollars out the door without understanding how much difference they're making in the community.
Yeah, I mean, I remember starting in like January, February is when I started actually in amount of time that we are past Ida. And my very first voicemail was from a pastor who decided to chair his LTR because they all had to get started right away. And they had a lot of expectations. And, you know, I had to come because I was a funder in Sandy. I had to be there at his LTRG. So I showed up, he met me at the door. And the first question he asked me was, how much money are you bringing? And I said, you know, how much need do you have? Let's start there. And I think that that's kind of the difference. And I think we do have the philanthropic community and corporate community now asking, I mean, the first question they asked me, what's the need? Where are the needs? Which is a very different conversation than we had.
So what does it take for people to feel comfortable to go in and collaborate, right? Like, so you have to build trust, right? So if you're going to be partnering with somebody, you have to figure out really what your good strengths and what your weaknesses are. And so when I did come on as the executive director for the long-term recovery group, was after 1 year. And the first thing, okay, all right, crazy story. So my job in FEMA was to help create the long-term recovery group. And then I got a job as the executive director. And the first thing I did was take everybody out to lunch individually and ask them how things were going, right? Because we had a person in charge of construction, person in charge of volunteers, person in charge of case management. And I took them out to lunch separately. And then the first thing I realized was, holy crap, there's no way we are going to be successful running all of those operations. We're never going to be good at construction, good at case management, good at raising the money, good at managing the volunteers. It was so overwhelming that we had to sit back and I had to realize, okay, who is out in the community that is doing the volunteerism successfully? Can we get that off our plate and can it still be run in the community? And there was people that are out there. Is there a nonprofit construction entity out there that could do a much better job than we are, because our poor IT guy was bringing hammers to the site. So you know that probably was a little off. So, but you had to feel comfortable first admitting, all right, we're not going to be good at all this stuff, right? So that's like internally that we had to come to that conclusion. Then you had to figure out, okay, who are the people that we could hand off this responsibility to and feel comfortable with? And then could we just focus on getting the money, getting the cases, running the unmet needs table? And, you know, so you need to find trust in partners, like getting the 13 churches, bless you, together. Those guys, I don't think they would have ever came together on their own. I think once you just kind of put out there, and the carrot was you had a seasoned person helping to write it. So there was their win, right? They got the win. They got to participate. They got to improve their church. They got to stay part of the recovery. And the trade-off was that they had to be part of a bigger system, but they got someone to write the grant, manage the grant. All they had to do is execute their side. So I think we have to go into this. If you're going to have collaborations, keep looking for where people's strengths are, so you can kind of create a league of superheroes, right? Like bring your strengths to the table and then find ways to, where is the win-win-win? Where is the win-win-win for everybody? Because that's part of it, right? Nobody wants to get into a relationship with somebody and then have them have one over on you, or you feel like, so put it all out on the table and find where's the piece of the puzzle that you can fit in and feel comfortable, and then how do we make it a win-win? And I think we all got to keep growing and learning how to get better at that, but I think that would be the best way to at least help encourage those collaborations.
So incentivize collaboration and look for the win.